Hello, everyone. My name is Brady Andrews, and I am a solution architect at Logicworks. We are a premier AWS partner, a Microsoft Gold partner, and an Azure Expert MSP. We provide professional and managed services for customers looking to migrate to the cloud, or maybe they're already existing in the cloud and they'd like to operate underneath Logicworks in a managed service environment. These are usually hyper-compliant customers with mission-critical applications, many of which include HIPAA, PCI, high trust, SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO, you name it, we've seen it. A lot of these are softwares that we've interacted with every day as end users, like bank softwares, hospital softwares. Today, we're going to talk about establishing a multi-account architecture when designing those environments by leveraging something called AWS Control Tower. Every company is different, so they all have different setups, and that's good and well. But many of those companies are made up of different teams and or business units with different initiatives, different teams needing different levels of access. And so something that I like to bring up is the principle of least privilege. We shouldn't have people from different BUs having access to everything. Someone in accounting may only need access to billing, while people working on the web app team or the client portal will need database access. And then finally, someone with compliance will really only need read access. Having a systematic approach to isolate these environments and the actions that a user could ultimately execute is really what this is all about. Traditionally, you could handle this isolation with a VPC hub and spoke model. I'd say that this works better at a smaller scale. So we can see that compliance has read-only access to both environments, accounting, like the last slide, only access to AWS Cost Explorer. Where this becomes complicated is as you start scaling and as you start adding SDLC tiers, it can add some complexity to the environment. Not to mention, as you scale out and then scale down with, or scale deep with multiple SDLC tiers, you may run into service limits with your VPC. So there's a couple different ways to go about solving this. Having a central managed account with underlying accounts to divide up those different BUs is a way that Control Tower can organize the layout of these environments so that they're isolated and there's not going to be those service limits per account. And instead of having a giant monolith that you splice up a million ways, really you're going to have a set of IAM permissions specific to, let's say, the client portal account or specific to the accounting account. So you can still achieve those previous goals that we saw, where accounting really only needs billing access, compliance really only needs read access. So it's a way to logically isolate each of these environments, set up the correct IAM permissions. Yeah. Another reason for organizing with multi-accounts is that when you're going through an audit, if you have PCI compliance on the table and you're sitting in a monolith, everything is evaluated, and the time to go through that scope is much longer. But with a foundational organized approach with the multi-account architecture, you can really set up accounts. Hey, these are my accounts that are requiring PCI compliance. These ones are out of scope. And so the time that it would take to go through that audit is much faster. And that's a huge benefit. If you can eliminate things that are out of scope, just so that PCI compliance audit scope will be much quicker. So to recap just why we would want multiple accounts, you can just do everything with only VPCs. It becomes complex, but as you scale out, having different workloads and then having different SDLC tiers for those workloads, it really makes a lot more sense to separate them out by account. You will have administrative isolation between who can perform actions where, because we all know there's different teams working on different BUs. I do understand that smaller companies, people wear multiple hats, and you can adjust accordingly with your IAM permissions. But largely, as you scale up and you reach the enterprise level, you don't have such small shops where everyone's wearing multiple hats. So to be able to administer permissions in a systematic way is super beneficial. It also limits the visibility and discoverability of those workloads. There isn't going to be cross-account access by default. That's something that you would have to go give permission for someone to be able to work across multiple accounts. So that isolation by default is very strong. This also kind of goes hand in hand with minimizing blast radius. A breach to an account or a failure of resources in a specific account isn't going to have that trickle-down effect or have visibility across those accounts. And like we said with auditing, if PCI is in scope or high trust or ISO, you can really lay the guardrails down for those specific accounts that need that compliance and not have to go through an entire environmental scope. The AWS tool and foundation that you would use to do this is AWS Control Tower. So previously, landing zones was the predecessor to Control Tower. There was a cumbersome pipeline where you had to make a lot of changes, and you had to, even if you were to adjust your CloudFormation templates, you had to update the pipeline. So it was very customizable, but it was very hands-on. And to start that process, you needed to engage a partner. It was required. With Control Tower, it's much more predefined, self-service, and I'd like to use the term user-friendly. Awesome reason for allowing for expansion over time is that we'll go into this a little bit later, but you can templatize those account structures. So it's not a, yes, I can create these isolated environments, but I have to do it every single time. For the PCI compliant, you can create a PCI compliant template, apply that to your new account, and you're off the ground and running. It's not a manual process over and over where you then have to update your pipeline, so on and so forth. So it really becomes easier as you scale over time. With a traditional Control Tower architecture, it'll launch with 4 accounts: a master account, a shared services account, a logging account, and a security account. The master account's really going to be Lambda, organizations, account vending machine or account factory, and AWS service catalog. Shared services is going to create the VPC and then make sure things like CloudTrail is enabled, configs enabled. This is also where you could put your directory services. Where a logging account, you're going to see an S3 bucket for centralized logging, and a security account for our firewall, our IDS, IPS solutions. So you really have an organized approach from the jump on what resources rely or reside where, and how they're going to interact with each other. With Logicworks, we really suggest not only using those foundational 4 accounts, but also setting up a network account and a billing account. But really, I like to focus on the networking account as the addition that Logicworks makes that is very helpful. You really will centralize your network traffic through that network account before it goes out to the adjacent accounts. So this is what the hub and spoke model on a Control Tower with Logicworks would look like. A use case we'd see here is we have a direct connect from 2 on-prem data centers to the AWS environment with those 4 standard security, logging, network, and shared accounts. We see that there's IDS and vulnerability scanning placed in the security account. We have shared resources like Bastion servers in the shared resources account. Application account really has common applications like Jira, Confluence, their backend database, but all this starts with that direct connect to the networking account and then to the Cisco CSRs and then out to the accounts. So for anomaly detection, IDS, IPS, all of that happens before it reaches the, happens when it reaches the hub before it reaches the spokes or the adjacent accounts. Really awesome piece is that templatizing approach whenever you are scaling, whether that's through acquisition or through organic in-house growth or a new initiative or a new business unit that you're standing up. IT or the underlying resources and infrastructure shouldn't be the thing that slows that process down. When there's new initiatives, there's likely a really good reason behind that. And you don't want the infrastructure and the back-end process to be the thing that slows down that time to value. So with Service Catalog, Lambda, organizations in these CloudFormation or Terraform stack sets, you can really templatize those accounts with things like the CloudTrail setup. Is encryption enabled? What is the VPC going to look like? Is this a read-only role? Do we have compliance guardrails specific to the compliance that we're going to be pursuing? So templatizing, that's really the sweet spot for Control Tower, is the isolation and the templatizing. Another use case for Control Tower is that it's perfect for SaaS companies. Each of their accounts, just like we said that there could be, the compliance team or the web app team, or really you could run it as this is customer 1, customer 2, customer 3, and so on and so forth. Each of these being a single tenant environment. And so that's awesome because you don't have this giant monolith where you're trying to figure out which customer was spending what money, how do I charge them back an accurate amount? You can actually see a breakdown by each of those accounts. And I also like to add on that other than this awesome chargeback feature is that you can see if these are internal accounts, okay, let's say AWS account 4, let's say that's resources that should have been decommissioned that we thought were decommissioned, but we're still being billed for. With like a giant environment, decommissioning resources and not having to pay for things you're not using is just as important as knowing where, what other resources are being billed. So having that visibility with Control Tower because of the specific account isolation is just fantastic. A case study was that we had Mortgage Bank come to us and they had a limited staff and a short timeline. They were PCI compliant. They did not want to disrupt many of their existing CI/CD processes, and they had a lack of security focused or compliance focused experience with AWS. So Logicworks being a premier AWS partner with focuses in security and compliance, we rebuilt their existing AWS environment into a Control Tower with security, compliance, and performance best practices. After go live, we provided them 24/7 NOC support, patching, backups, incident response, and monitoring. So a lot of those day-to-day tasks that they had the pressure of a limited staff and short timeline, we were able to alleviate. So we were able to give them 100% of their time back on focusing on product features. Their environment has a 100% availability, and they've lowered infrastructure costs by 10%, and reduced in-house staffing costs by over 80%, because they really don't have to fight to keep the lights on. They can focus on driving innovation, creating revenue through their app. In summary, Control Tower is great whenever you have a complex, regulated, large AWS deployment. You can use it in smaller environments, but depending on the size, you may be able to achieve similar outcomes with just using VPCs if you're not going to run into service limits. But as you grow, that can become much more complex. Templatizing with Account Factory over having to do that manual work when you're setting up in new environments, cannot speak highly enough about it. That is really the secret sauce of a lot of Control Tower. The governance through our automation kind of goes hand in hand with that. The network isolation, the account isolation, the principle of least privilege of determining which resources can interact with which, who should be able to interact with those resources. It really lets you wrap your arms around your environment and have the control that you will want as you scale. Because I think that a pain point is that, if you grow too quickly, there's cloud sprawl. And so it's certainly an environment where you want to maintain control at all times. And definitely, like I said earlier, depending on the size of the environment, you should carefully evaluate whether you should just do it with traditionally only VPCs, or if maybe it is time to move to a control tower. And that's something that Logicworks can definitely help evaluate with and build. I think that's all. Thank you, Ron.